Vezin stayed on from day to day, indefinitely, much longer than he had intended. He felt in a kind of dazed, somnolent condition. He did nothing in particular, but the place fascinated him, and he could not decide to leave. Decisions were always very difficult for him, and he sometimes wondered how he had ever brought himself to the point of leaving the train. It seemed as though someone else must have arranged it for him. And once or twice his thoughts ran to the swarthy Frenchman who had sat opposite. If only he could have understood that long sentence ending so strangely with "à cause du sommeil et à cause des chats." He wondered what it all meant. Meanwhile, the hushed softness of the town held him prisoner, and he sought in his muddling, gentle way to find out where the mystery lay and what it was all about. But his limited French and his constitutional hatred of active investigation made it hard for him to buttonhole anybody and ask questions. He was content to observe and watch and remain negative. The weather held on calm and hazy, and this just suited him. He wandered about the town till he knew every street and alley. The people suffered him to come and go, without let or hindrance, though it became clearer to him every day that he was never free himself from observation. The town watched him as a cat watches a mouse, and he got no nearer to finding out what they were all so busy with, or where the main stream of their activities lay. This remained hidden. The people were as soft and mysterious as cats. But that he was continually under observation became more evident from day to day. For instance, when he strolled to the end of the town and entered a little green public garden beneath the ramparts and seated himself upon one of the empty benches in the sun, he was quite alone. At first, not another seat was occupied. The little park was empty, the paths deserted. Yet within 10 minutes of his coming, there must have been fully 20 persons scattered about him, some strolling aimlessly along the gravel walks, staring at the flowers, and others seated on the wooden benches, enjoying the sun like himself. None of them appeared to take any notice of him, yet he understood quite well they had all come there to watch. They kept him under close observation. In the street they had seemed busy enough, hurrying upon various errands, yet these were suddenly all forgotten, and they had nothing to do but loll and laze in the sun, their duties unremembered. 5 minutes after he left, the garden was again deserted, the seats vacant. But in the crowded street it was the same thing again. He was never alone. He was ever in their thoughts. By degrees, too, he began to see how it was he was so cleverly watched, yet without the appearance of it. The people did nothing directly. They behaved obliquely. He laughed in his mind as the thought thus clothed itself in words, but the phrase exactly described it. They looked at him from angles which naturally should have led their sight in another direction altogether. Their movements were oblique too, so far as these concerned himself. The straight, direct thing was not their way, evidently. They did nothing, obviously. If he entered a shop to buy, the woman walked instantly away and busied herself with something at the farther end of the counter, though answering at once when he spoke, showing that she knew he was there, and that this was only her way of attending to him. It was the fashion of the cat she followed. Even in the dining room of the inn, the bewhiskered and courteous waiter, lithe and silent in all his movements, never seemed able to come straight to his table for an order or a dish. He came by zigzags, indirectly, vaguely, so that he appeared to be going to another table altogether, and only turned suddenly at the last moment, and was there beside him. Vezin smiled curiously to himself as he described how he began to realize these things. Other tourists there were none in the hostel, but he recalled the figures of 1 or 2 old men inhabitants who took their déjeuner and dinner there, and remembered how fantastically they entered the room in similar fashion. First, they paused in the doorway, peering about the room, and then, after a temporary inspection, they came in, as it were, sideways, keeping close to the walls, so that he wondered which table they were making for, and at the last minute making almost a little quick run to their particular seats. And again he thought of the ways and methods of cats. Other small incidents, too, impressed him as all part of this queer, soft town with its muffled, indirect life, for the way some of the people appeared and disappeared with extraordinary swiftness puzzled him exceedingly. It may have been all perfectly natural, he knew, yet he could not make it out how the alleys swallowed them up and shot them forth in a second of time, when there were no visible doorways or openings near enough to explain the phenomenon. Once he followed two elderly women who he felt had been particularly examining him from across the street. Quite near the inn this was, and saw them turn the corner a few feet only in front of him. Yet when he sharply followed on their heels, he saw nothing but an utterly deserted alley stretching in front of him with no sign of a living thing, and the only opening through which they could have escaped was a porch some 50 yards away, which not the swiftest human runner could have reached in time. And in just such sudden fashion, people appeared when he never expected them. Once when he heard a great noise of fighting going on behind a low wall, and hurried up to see what was going on, what should he see but a group of girls and women engaged in vociferous conversation, which instantly hushed itself to the normal whispering note of the town when his head appeared over the wall. And even then, none of them turned to look at him directly, but slunk off with the most unaccountable rapidity into doors and sheds across the yard. And their voices, he thought, had sounded so strangely like, the angry snarling of fighting animals, almost of cats. The whole spirit of the town, however, continued to evade him as something elusive, protean, screened from the outer world, and at the same time intensely, genuinely vital. And since he now formed part of its life, this concealment puzzled and irritated him. More, it began rather to frighten him. Out of the mists that slowly gathered about his ordinary surface thoughts, there rose again the idea that the inhabitants were waiting for him to declare himself, to take an attitude, to do this or to do that, and that when he had done so, they in their turn would at length make some direct response, accepting or rejecting him. Yet the vital matter, concerning which his decision was awaited, came no nearer to him. Once or twice he purposely followed little processions or groups of the citizens in order to find out, if possible, on what purpose they were bent. But they always discovered him in time and dwindled away, each individual going his or her way. It was always the same. He never could learn what their main interest was. The cathedral was ever empty, the old church of St. Martin, at the other end of the town, deserted. They shopped because they had to, not because they wished to. The booths stood neglected, the stalls unvisited, the little cafes desolate. Yet the streets were always full, the townsfolk ever on the bustle. Can it be, he thought to himself, yet with a deprecating laugh, that he should have dared to think anything so odd, can it be that these people are people of the twilight, that they live only at night their real life, and come out honestly only with the dusk, that during the day they make a sham, though brave, pretense, and after the sun is down, their true life begins? Have they the souls of night things, and is the whole blessed town in the hands of the cats? The fancy somehow electrified him with little shocks of shrinking and dismay, yet though he affected to laugh, he knew that he was beginning to feel more than uneasy, and that strange forces were tugging with 1,000 invisible cords at the very centre of his being. Something utterly remote from his ordinary life, something that had not waked for years, began faintly to stir in his soul, sending feelers abroad into his brain and heart, shaping queer thoughts and penetrating even into certain of his minor actions. Something exceedingly vital to himself, to his soul, hung in the balance. And always when he returned to the inn about the hour of sunset, he saw the figures of the townsfolk stealing through the dusk from their shop doors, moving sentry-wise to and fro at the corners of the streets, yet always vanishing silently like shadows at his near approach. And as the inn invariably closed its doors at 10 o'clock, he had never yet found the opportunity he rather half-heartedly sought to see for himself what account the town could give of itself at night. À cause du sommeil, Aïṛᴇɪᴜ. The words now rang in his ears more and more often, though still, as yet, without any definite meaning. Moreover, something made him sleep like the dead. It was, I think, on the 5th day, though in this detail his story sometimes varied, that he made a definite discovery which increased his alarm and brought him up to a rather sharp climax. Before that he had already noticed that a change was going forward and certain subtle transformations being brought about in his character which modified several of his minor habits. And he had affected to ignore them. Here, however, was something he could no longer ignore, and it startled him. At the best of times he was never very positive, always negative rather, compliant and acquiescent. Yet, when necessity arose, he was capable of reasonably vigorous action and could take a strongish decision. The discovery he now made that brought him up with such a sharp turn was that this power had positively dwindled to nothing. He found it impossible to make up his mind. For on this 5th day he realized that he had stayed long enough in the town, and that for reasons he could only vaguely define to himself, it was wiser and safer that he should leave. And he found that he could not leave. This is difficult to describe in words, and it was more by gesture and the expression of his face that he conveyed to Dr. Silence the state of impotence he had reached. All this spying and watching, he said, had, as it were, spun a net about his feet, so that he was trapped and powerless to escape. He felt like a fly that had blundered into the intricacies of a great web. He was caught, imprisoned, and could not get away. It was a distressing sensation. A numbness had crept over his will, till it had become almost incapable of decision. The mere thought of vigorous action, action towards escape, began to terrify him. All the currents of his life had turned inwards upon himself, striving to bring to the surface something that lay buried almost beyond reach, determined to force his recognition of something he had long forgotten. Forgotten years upon years, centuries almost ago. It seemed as though a window deep within his being would presently open and reveal an entirely new world, yet somehow a world that was not unfamiliar. Beyond that again, he fancied a great curtain hung, and when that too rolled up, he would see still farther into this region, and at last understand something of the secret life of these extraordinary people. "Is this why they wait and watch?" he asked himself with rather a shaking heart. "For the time when I shall join them, or refuse to join them? Does the decision rest with me after all, and not with them?" And it was at this point that the sinister character of the adventure first really declared itself, and he became genuinely alarmed. The stability of his rather fluid little personality was at stake, he felt, and something in his heart turned coward. Why otherwise should he have suddenly taken to walking stealthily, silently, making as little sound as possible, forever looking behind him? Why else should he have moved almost on tiptoe about the passages of the practically deserted inn, and when he was abroad have found himself deliberately taking advantage of what cover presented itself? And why, if he was not afraid, should the wisdom of staying indoors after sundown have suddenly occurred to him as eminently desirable? Why, indeed? And when John Silence gently pressed him for an explanation of these things, he admitted apologetically that he had none to give. "It was simply that I feared something might happen to me unless I kept a sharp lookout. I felt afraid. It was instinctive," was all he could say. "I got the impression that the whole town was after me, wanted me for something, and that if it got me, I should lose myself, or at least the self I knew, in some unfamiliar state of consciousness. But I am not a psychologist, you know," he added meekly, "and I cannot define it better than that." It was while lounging in the courtyard half an hour before the evening meal that Vezin made this discovery, and he at once went upstairs to his quiet room at the end of the winding passage to think it over alone. In the yard it was empty enough, true, but there was always the possibility that the big woman whom he dreaded would come out of some door with her pretence of knitting to sit and watch him. This had happened several times, and he could not endure the sight of her. He still remembered his original fancy, bizarre though it was, that she would spring upon him the moment his back was turned and land with one single crushing leap upon his neck. Of course it was nonsense, but then it haunted him, and once an idea begins to do that, it ceases to be nonsense. It has clothed itself in reality. He went upstairs accordingly. It was dusk, and the oil lamps had not yet been lit in the passages. He stumbled over the uneven surface of the ancient flooring, passing the dim outlines of doors along the corridor, doors that he had never once seen opened, rooms that seemed never occupied. He moved, as his habit now was, stealthily and on tiptoe. Halfway down the last passage to his own chamber there was a sharp turn, and it was just here, while groping round the walls with outstretched hands, that his fingers touched something that was not wall, something that moved. It was soft and warm in texture, indescribably fragrant, and about the height of his shoulder, and he immediately thought of a furry, sweet-smelling kitten. The next minute he knew it was something quite different. Instead of investigating, however, his nerves must have been too overwrought for that, he said. He shrank back as closely as possible against the wall on the other side. The thing, whatever it was, slipped past him with a sound of rustling, and retreating with light footsteps down the passage behind him, was gone. A breath of warm, scented air was wafted to his nostrils. Vezin caught his breath for an instant and paused, stock-still, half leaning against the wall, and then almost ran down the remaining distance and entered his room with a rush, locking the door hurriedly behind him. Yet it was not fear that made him run. It was excitement, pleasurable excitement. His nerves were tingling, and a delicious glow made itself felt all over his body. In a flash it came to him that this was just what he had felt 25 years ago as a boy, when he was in love for the first time. Warm currents of life ran all over him and mounted to his brain in a whirl of soft delight. His mood was suddenly become tender, melting, loving. The room was quite dark, and he collapsed upon the sofa by the window, wondering what had happened to him and what it all meant. But the only thing he understood clearly in that instant was that something in him had swiftly, magically changed. He no longer wished to leave or to argue with himself about leaving. The encounter in the passageway had changed all that. The strange perfume of it still hung about him, bemusing his heart and mind. For he knew that it was a girl who had passed him, a girl's face that his fingers had brushed in the darkness, and he felt in some extraordinary way as though he had been actually kissed by her, kissed full upon the lips. Trembling, he sat upon the sofa by the window and struggled to collect his thoughts. He was utterly unable to understand how the mere passing of a girl in the darkness of a narrow passageway could communicate so electric a thrill to his whole being that he still shook with the sweetness of it. Yet there it was, and he found it as useless to deny as to attempt analysis. Some ancient fire had entered his veins, and now ran coursing through his blood, and that he was 45 instead of 20 did not matter one little jot. Out of all the inner turmoil and confusion emerged the one salient fact, that the mere atmosphere, the merest casual touch of this girl, unseen, unknown in the darkness, had been sufficient to stir dormant fires in the centre of his heart, and rouse his whole being from a state of feeble sluggishness to one of tearing and tumultuous excitement. After a time, however, the number of Vezin's years began to assert their cumulative power. He grew calmer, and when a knock came at length upon his door, and he heard the waiter's voice suggesting that dinner was nearly over, he pulled himself together and slowly made his way downstairs into the dining-room. Everyone looked up as he entered, for he was very late, but he took his customary seat in the far corner and began to eat. The trepidation was still in his nerves, but the fact that he had passed through the courtyard and hall without catching sight of a petticoat served to calm him a little. He ate so fast that he had almost caught up with the current stage of the table d'hôte, when a slight commotion in the room drew his attention. His chair was so placed that the door and the greater portion of the long salle à manger were behind him, Yet it was not necessary to turn round to know that the same person he had passed in the dark passage had now come into the room. He felt the presence long before he heard or saw anyone. Then he became aware that the old men, the only other guests, were rising one by one in their places and exchanging greetings with someone who passed among them from table to table. And when at length he turned with his heart beating furiously to ascertain for himself, he saw the form of a young girl, lithe and slim, moving down the centre of the room and making straight for his own table in the corner. She moved wonderfully, with sinuous grace, like a young panther, and her approach filled him with such delicious bewilderment that he was utterly unable to tell at first what her face was like, or discover what it was about the whole presentment of the creature that filled him anew with trepidation and delight. "Mademoiselle est de retour," he heard the old waiter murmur at his side, and he was just able to take in that she was the daughter of the proprietress when she was upon him, and he heard her voice. She was addressing him. Something of red lips he saw, and laughing white teeth, and stray wisps of fine dark hair about the temples. But all the rest was a dream in which his own emotion rose like a thick cloud before his eyes and prevented his seeing accurately, or knowing exactly what he did. He was aware that she greeted him with a charming little bow, that her beautiful large eyes looked searchingly into his own, that the perfume he had noticed in the dark passage again assailed his nostrils, and that she was bending a little towards him and leaning with one hand on the table at his side. She was quite close to him. That was the chief thing he knew, explaining that she had been asking after the comfort of her mother's guests, and was now introducing herself to the latest arrival, himself. "Monsieur has already been here a few days," he heard the waiter say. Then her own voice, sweet as singing, replied, "But Monsieur is not going to leave us just yet, I hope. My mother is too old to look after the comfort of our guests properly, but now I am here. I will remedy all that." She laughed deliciously. "Monsieur shall be well looked after." Vezin, struggling with his emotion and desire to be polite, half rose to acknowledge the pretty speech and to stammer some sort of reply, but as he did so his hand by chance touched her own that was resting upon the table, and a shock that was for all the world like a shock of electricity passed from her skin into his body. His soul wavered and shook deep within him. He caught her eyes fixed upon his own with a look of most curious intentness, and the next moment he knew that he had sat down wordless again on his chair, that the girl was already halfway across the room, and that he was trying to eat his salad with a dessert spoon and a knife. Longing for her return and yet dreading it, he gulped down the remainder of his dinner, and then he went at once to his bedroom to be alone with his thoughts. This time the passages were lighted, and he suffered no exciting contretemps. Yet the winding corridor was dim with shadows, and the last portion, from the bend of the walls onwards, seemed longer than he had ever known it. It ran downhill like the pathway on a mountainside, and as he tiptoed softly down it, he felt that by rights it ought to have led him clean out of the house into the heart of a great forest. The world was singing with him. Strange fancies filled his brain, and once in the room, with the door securely locked, he did not light the candles, but sat by the open window, thinking long, long thoughts that came unbidden in troops to his mind. This part of the story he told to Dr. Silence, without special coaxing, it is true, yet with much stammering embarrassment. He could not in the least understand, he said, how the girl had managed to affect him so profoundly, and even before he had set eyes upon her. For her mere proximity in the darkness had been sufficient to set him on fire. He knew nothing of enchantments, and for years had been a stranger to anything approaching tender relations with any member of the opposite sex, for he was encased in shyness, and realized his overwhelming defects only too well. Yet this bewitching young creature came to him deliberately. Her manner was unmistakable, and she sought him out on every possible occasion. Chaste and sweet she was undoubtedly, yet frankly inviting, and she won him utterly with the first glance of her shining eyes, even if she had not already done so in the dark merely by the magic of her invisible presence. "You felt she was altogether wholesome and good?" queried the doctor. You had no reaction of any sort, for instance, of alarm?" Vezin looked up sharply with one of his inimitable little apologetic smiles. It was some time before he replied. The mere memory of the adventure had suffused his shy face with blushes, and his brown eyes sought the floor again before he answered. "I don't think I can quite say that," he explained presently. "I acknowledged certain qualms, sitting up in my room afterwards. Conviction grew upon me that there was something about her, how shall I express it? Something unholy. It is not impurity in any sense, physical or mental, that I mean, but something quite indefinable that gave me a vague sensation of the creeps. She drew me, and at the same time repelled me, more than... He hesitated, blushing furiously, and unable to finish the sentence. "Nothing like it has ever come to me before or since," he concluded, with lame confusion. "I suppose it was, as you suggested just now, something of an enchantment. At any rate, it was strong enough to make me feel that I would stay in that awful little haunted town for years, if only I could see her every day, hear her voice, watch her wonderful movements, and sometimes, perhaps, touch her hand." "Can you explain to me what you felt was the source of her power?" John Silence asked, looking purposely anywhere but at the narrator. "Well, I am surprised that you should ask me such a question," answered Vezin, with the nearest approach to dignity he could manage. "I think no man can describe to another convincingly wherein lies the magic of the woman who ensnares him. I certainly cannot. I can only say this slip of a girl bewitched me, and the mere knowledge that she was living and sleeping in the same house filled me with an extraordinary sense of delight. But there's one thing I can tell you," he went on earnestly, his eyes aglow, "namely, that she seemed to sum up and synthesize in herself all the strange hidden forces that operated so mysteriously in the town and its inhabitants. She had the silken movements of the panther, going smoothly, silently to and fro, and the same indirect, oblique methods as the townsfolk, screening, like them, secret purposes of her own, purposes that I was sure had me for their objective. She kept me to my terror and delight, ceaselessly under observation, yet so carelessly, so consummately, that another man, less sensitive, if I may say so," he made a deprecating gesture, "or less prepared by what had gone before, would never have noticed it at all. She was always still, always reposeful, yet she seemed to be everywhere at once, so that I never could escape from her. I was continually meeting the stare and laughter of her great eyes, in the corners of the rooms, in the passages, calmly looking at me through the windows, or in the busiest parts of the public streets." Their intimacy, it seems, grew very rapidly after this first encounter, which had so violently disturbed the little man's equilibrium. He was naturally very prim, and prim folk live mostly in so small a world that anything violently unusual may shake them clean out of it, and they therefore instinctively distrust originality. But Vezin began to forget his primness after a while. The girl was always modestly behaved, and as her mother's representative, she naturally had to do with the guests in the hotel. It was not out of the way that a spirit of camaraderie should spring up. Besides, she was young, she was charmingly pretty, she was French, and she obviously liked him. At the same time, there was something indescribable, a certain indefinable atmosphere of other places, other times, that made him try hard to remain on his guard, and sometimes made him catch his breath with a sudden start. It was all rather like a delirious dream, half delight, half dread, he confided in a whisper to Dr. Silence, and more than once he hardly knew quite what he was doing or saying, as though he were driven forward by impulses he scarcely recognized as his own. And though the thought of leaving presented itself again and again to his mind, it was each time with less insistence, so that he stayed on from day to day, becoming more and more a part of the sleepy life of this dreamy medieval town, losing more and more of his recognizable personality. Soon he felt The curtain within would roll up with an awful rush, and he would find himself suddenly admitted into the secret purposes of the hidden life that lay behind it all. Only by that time he would have become transformed into an entirely different being.